Dear friends in Rome, I'm sorry I can't be with you in person. There's an illness in the family. I am well, but someone in my family is not, and it made this journey impossible today, for which I apologize. I would particularly have liked to be sitting next to Ambassador Paolo Ducci of the Ducci Foundation, Professor Lucio Caricciolo, my old friend Fausto Bertanotti, Professor Gianni De Michelis, and Professor Giuseppe Vacca from the Antonio Gramsci Foundation, with whom one would have discussed a great deal. Given that I am not with you, I will keep my remarks very brief, especially as they are also being spoken in a foreign language, and not many people in Italy speak English, though they will now have to, I think, because many will be leaving to find jobs elsewhere, which brings me to the subject that we're discussing today, communism. Now, what is there to say about this that hasn't been said 100 or 1,000 times before by people on the left, but not exclusively on the left? Let me start by saying that we are having this discussion at a time when the capitalist system is going through a huge crisis, the worst crisis since 1929 and the 1930s, and this crisis is now affecting politics on every level. The Soviet leader Vladimir Lenin once described politics as little more than concentrated economics. If this was not totally accurate at the time, it is now completely accurate. Wherever you look in the advanced capitalist world, politics is concentrated economics or money. In your own country, in Italy, you have a banker elected by parliament or accepted by parliament running your country. In Greece, it's the same. And the irony of this is that the same bankers and the same banks and the same institutions that created this crisis are still running the world. There has been no attempt to find alternatives, to look for different structures, to see how things could change and be done in a different way, because capitalism will not tolerate it. And the reason why it will not tolerate it is because no alternative exists on a global level today as existed from 1917 to 1990. Now, this was a bad model, as we know. And it gets talked about as a bad model. But the aims of it at the very beginning were not bad. What were the aims? The aims were to run society in the interests of the majority of working people who live in these countries where people were trying to bring about change, to use the state to transform living conditions and create a level of emancipation that would finally make the state itself dispensable and lead to collectives and cooperatives of workers and peasants and other people to run these societies. So the aim was not anti-democratic. The aim was to increase democracy qualitatively by changing the economic basis, which was profit, which was the dominant system at the time. And that failed for a variety of reasons. It failed because the rulers of Europe got frightened by the success of the Bolsheviks in 1917. In my opinion, without the success of the Bolsheviks in Russia, we would not have had fascism in Germany or Italy. And if we want to put it another way, what would the world have looked like if a revolution had taken place in Germany first and Russia later? I think very different. Because as Gramsci himself pointed out, the revolution in Russia was a revolution against capital. By this, he didn't mean capitalism, though it was that too, but against the tenets of capital as advanced by Marx both in the manifesto and in his other writings, that the system which he was defending was a system much better suited to advanced countries, advanced economically and politically. Tsarist Russia was neither. It's no good now delving into all that. The way in which that system was attempted failed. And I think it failed largely, not necessarily because of its economy, which was faulty and weak, by the way, but also it failed politically because it failed to create a contact between rulers and ruled. There were no intermediary organizations which could convey to the rulers of this new land what ordinary people wanted, what their needs were. Politics, more or less, became a monopoly of the party and state bureaucracies, and the bulk of people were excluded from the running of the system. Now, within the capitalist world, that was not the case. Adult franchise in terms of one person, one vote only came about after the First World War. But even before that, there were huge movements in Britain, in Germany, in the United States for democratic rights. So people had to struggle hard for these rights, but they struggled for them. In Tsarist Russia, they did not struggle for too long about anything. The First World War broke up that structure. And what emerged? Emerged with a blank slate. There was no tradition of democracy of any sort in that country, and that weighed heavily on the shoulders of the early leaders of the Soviet Union. And, you know, if you look at their writings, all of them, virtually all of them, Lenin, Bukharin, Trotsky, Kamenev, Zinoviev, were saying, without the German Revolution we are finished. How long can we retain state power? The fact that they retained it for 70 years is a bit surprising, because most other European revolutions, whether you take the English in the 17th century or the French in the 18th century, lasted 10, 15, 20 years. Russia, they lasted 70 years, and the heritage of that form of rule is still with us, with Putin and Medvedev and these people who are currently ruling. So that is not a big disputed issue any longer. We all know that. The disputed issue is, are we now, because of this single failure of communism, it failed once, but capitalism as a system has failed many times and has proved more resilient. That doesn't mean necessarily that it is a socially just system. If anything, the contrary. And people are beginning to feel this now in different parts of the world without having an alternative. But we are now at a stage with capitalism, because it's impossible to discuss communism without discussing its main enemy, capitalism. We are now at a stage with capitalism where democracy itself is becoming hollowed out, where new forms of neocolonialism are being put. The United States, since the 1980s, has intervened or created or fought 16 different wars and is now planning with the Israelis another one in Iran. The European states, by and large, are vassal states, as you know full well, very rarely capable of acting independently on their own, having an independent foreign policy or an independent social and economic policy. That is Europe's tragedy. So what are we to do? I think the alternative that has to be created has to state very clearly, in my opinion, that many of the ideas for which we fought were not wrong per se. They were not wrong on principle. They happened at a time when the states, the people that came to power, couldn't carry them out. But these things are needed. Do we not need now for people the benefits of health, the benefits of education, the benefits of cheap public housing, the benefit of the right to work? Are these now to be totally ignored because we can't challenge capitalism or this type of capitalism? And when people say it's impossible. Why is it impossible? Of course, we know partially why it's impossible. That the only time in which people were given some reforms within the capitalist system were the crucial years after the First and mainly the Second World War, when the powers that be in the West, the United States and its European allies, felt that the only way they could defeat communism was by permitting reforms in these countries. So in most of Europe, you had the state intervening to create a social welfare system which provided people with an absolutely necessary and crucial safety net. The same people, in many cases the same people, what was known as Keynesianism, in many cases the same people then began to remove that net slowly, and in the 1980s, the new measures that were put in by the United States, backed by Britain, were that we now no longer needed this nanny state, a state which looked after people that was intrinsically wrong, and the only function of the state should be to remove all impediments to private capital. So private capital was now allowed to enter the most hallowed domains of social provision and social welfare. And this happened in country after country. And after the collapse of the Soviet Union and the fall of the Berlin Wall, capital and its agents, political and economic, felt they had nothing to prove anymore. So all the gains that were permitted to post-war governments, to social democratic parties, in some cases to communist parties, as in France, were taken away because there was no resistance anymore, either on a global or on an internal level. And this is the situation in which we find ourselves today, that we have essentially a neoliberal system, which is another way of saying a system which lives and defines itself essentially through rapacious profits, what the American kids who have been part of the Occupy movement had started calling the 1% versus the 99%. But I'm afraid it's not versus the 99%, because the majority of the 99% still don't know what to do. They have no idea what alternatives need to be pushed forward. And I will say it very bluntly, that the world has a very bleak future unless the state intervenes to challenge capital, which is difficult if you're a capitalist state and act as an executive committee for capitalism. Most of Europe is opposed to the war in Afghanistan. It takes place. And yet at the same time, we have a situation where we are told that any individual violence, i.e. terrorism, you can be locked up for even thinking it. And people are locked up. One woman was locked up in Britain for revealing on the internet letter she had a dream in which something was destroyed that made her happy in her dream. And for that she was sentenced to prison. And at the same time, state violence goes on endlessly. So we need something different. We need to think differently. We need to break out of this pattern that has been established and which has led to a collapse. The world and each single country, the rich are fine because the system now is created for them. The state, which is not allowed to intervene to help the poor, helps the rich. That is what goes on. And how can a system like this last? It's very difficult. So changes will have to come, and especially for people on the left who moved to the right and who have no ideas left at all now in their heads. Their heads are empty. They see what other parts of the world are doing and follow blindly. I say you have to rethink very hard, because effectively what exists in Europe is a dictatorship of capital, and a dictatorship of capital in which you have an extreme center, which encompasses center-left and center-right, and this extreme center is in agreement on fighting wars abroad, in most cases, occupying other countries supposedly in the name of democratic ideals, keeping this form of capitalist economy going, defending austerity measures, seeing Europe on the verge, or many parts of Europe, 6 countries now, on the verge of a social breakdown, and hoping that somehow things will be sorted out on their own. Well, I'm telling you they won't. Thank you very much, and sorry I couldn't be there in person.